The night outside Manhattan was hushed and glossy, but inside the Reynolds Grand Hotel, tension moved under the crystal chandeliers like an invisible current that only a few could feel. Ethan Reynolds, 38 years old, billionaire hotel magnate and owner of the city's most prestigious five-star landmark, stood behind a half-closed door in one of his own corridors, wrapped in a tailored suit that usually signaled power and control to everyone who looked his way. Tonight, however, he was not the untouchable CEO whose name crowned the building in shining letters. Tonight he felt more like a shadow haunting his own empire, a man holding his breath as he prepared to confront something he did not completely understand. For months, little discrepancies had followed him like gnats around a light: towels mysteriously missing from inventory, invoices inflated by just enough to escape casual notice, expensive bottles of wine that never made it onto the official records. His manager, Daniel Cooper, had shrugged each concern away with practiced ease, insisting that these were simple accounting errors or minor staff mistakes, nothing worth the owner's personal attention. Ethan had not become a billionaire by accepting soothing explanations, so he did the one thing nobody in the building would have imagined. He checked into his own hotel under a false identity. Ethan Grant, a mid-level businessman from Boston with a bland backstory, determined to see his creation through the eyes of an ordinary guest who carried no power and no name recognition. The first few days of his undercover stay confirmed that something in the foundations had begun to rot, even if the marble floors still shone. Bartenders poured weaker drinks when they thought no one important was watching. Waiters slid extra tips into their pockets and adjusted bills with a casual flick of the pen. The concierge desk, which was meant to represent gracious service, quietly double-charged tourists who would never know the difference. These were irritations more than catastrophes, small betrayals that stung his pride but did not yet threaten the structure of the business. What truly mattered to him, he realized, was the honesty of the housekeeping staff, because they were the unseen witnesses to everything that happened behind closed doors, the invisible presence in every luxury suite. That was when he noticed her. Grace Miller, 26, newly hired, wearing the standard blue housekeeping uniform that made most employees blend into the background, walked the corridors with a sense of deliberate focus that caught Ethan's attention. Her brown hair was tied neatly back, her posture straight, but her eyes carried the weight of quiet exhaustion that no amount of coffee could erase. She worked with a precision that suggested training and pride, yet when she thought no one was looking, the slight trembling in her hands betrayed an inner battle. Ethan found himself tracking her shifts and routes, not because he felt immediate attraction, but because there was something in her combination of fragility and resolve that would not let him look away, as if he were watching someone hold up the ceiling of their world with bare hands. One morning, he decided to test her, not with a hidden camera or a secret report, but with a scenario crafted to tempt almost anyone. He left his suite in deliberate disarray, the bed unmade, clothes scattered, and placed $50 in cash loosely on the nightstand. He left a gold watch near the sink and draped a diamond bracelet recklessly across the bedspread, all of it arranged like a quiet challenge. Then he stepped into the hallway and took up a position just beyond the door, hidden in the shadow where he could see through a small crack. 10 minutes later, Grace approached with her cleaning cart, knocked 3 times with professional politeness, and let herself inside. Ethan watched with a calm expression that did not match the sharp attention behind his eyes, evaluating every motion. She did not pocket a single thing. Grace picked up the watch, only to wipe beneath it, returning it to exactly the same spot with almost surgical care. She handled the bracelet as though it might shatter, folding it gently and placing it neatly on the bed. The bills on the nightstand she straightened, smoothing the edges with a kind of respect, but she never slipped even one into her pocket. Her focus did not drift toward temptation, not once. Ethan felt the corner of his mouth lift in the closest thing he allowed himself to a smile. In a world where everyone seemed to have a price, he had finally found one piece of his empire that appeared incorruptible. Then the phone in the room rang, slicing through the calm like a shard of glass. Grace froze. For a heartbeat, she simply stared at the ringing phone as if it were a bomb about to detonate. She hesitated, then reached for it, her eyes flicking around the empty room with the instinct of someone who always wondered whether they were being watched. When she spoke, her voice was no longer the polite, professional tone of a hotel employee. It sounded raw and fragile, almost like a frightened child trying to sound brave. "Hello. Yes, this is Grace Miller," she said. There was a pause, and the silence on her end grew so heavy that Ethan could almost feel it pressing against the walls. Her shoulders stiffened. The hand gripping the phone began to shake uncontrollably. Ethan leaned closer to the door, every rational instinct telling him that he had already crossed a line and should give her privacy, but something stronger rooted him to the spot. "No, please, not again," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He was fine yesterday." She sat down abruptly on the edge of the unmade bed, her free hand flying to her mouth as if she could hold back the sob that still broke through. Ethan's chest tightened with the uncomfortable awareness that he was watching a moment no stranger was meant to see, but he could not force himself to turn away. "Yes, I understand," Grace managed after a long moment of strained breathing. "I'll come right away. Just, please do whatever you have to do and don't wait for me. I'll find the money somehow." The word money echoed in Ethan's mind with a sharpness that stunned him, because he heard in it not greed, but desperation. She ended the call and sat perfectly still for several seconds, as if trying to reassemble herself, then wiped her face with rough, angry motions, punishing her own tears. She rose and finished cleaning the room with mechanical precision, folding towels and aligning pillows, while silent tears still slid down her cheeks. Before leaving, she placed the $50 back exactly where it had been and whispered to herself, barely audible, "Hold it together, Grace. Just hold it together." Ethan pressed his back against the corridor wall, feeling something twist inside him in a way that had nothing to do with profit or loss. He had set out to catch a thief and instead had discovered a woman crumbling inward in complete silence, clinging to honesty, even as life squeezed her from every side. That evening, in the anonymity of his undercover suite, Ethan called Daniel. His voice was clipped and businesslike, but there was an urgency beneath it. "Get me everything you can on a housekeeper named Grace Miller," he ordered. Daniel hesitated before replying. "She's new, hired last week," he said. "Her references checked out, spotless record, nothing suspicious. She's a single mother, that's all I have so far." "Single mother," Ethan repeated quietly, tasting the words as if they might explain everything. "What about the father?" "Walked out a long time ago from what I've heard," Daniel said. "Rumor is her son's sick, but I don't know the details." Ethan ended the call without another word and stared at the $50 he had left on his own nightstand as part of his test, bills that suddenly looked cheap and meaningless. That amount meant nothing to him. He could lose 10 times that on a minor investment mistake and barely blink. To Grace, it might have been the difference between paying for dinner or sending her child to bed hungry. And still, with a broken voice and a shaking body, she had refused to take even $1 that was not hers. Sleep did not come easily that night. Instead, he opened his laptop and typed her name into a search bar, following link after link, until he found an old fundraising page with a photo of a thin, pale boy whose smile still somehow reached his eyes. The headline read, "Help Noah Miller, age 7, fight for his life." Ethan scrolled through the story, each line hitting him with the weight of a closing door. Noah had been born with a rare hardened lung condition, a cruel defect that made every breath a battle. His mother, Grace, had been waging war on his behalf for years, taking 2 jobs, selling possessions, begging hospitals to move him up a waiting list that moved too slowly. The surgery that could save him cost $60,000. The donations listed on the page added up to barely 300 or 400, a sad trickle against an ocean of need. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his face lit by the pale glow of the screen, and thought about the chandelier he had ordered for the lobby last month that had cost more than the entire surgery. The following morning, Ethan walked through his hotel like a man who had stepped into his own life and found it suddenly unfamiliar. The marble floors, the gold-rimmed elevators, the designer furniture, everything that had once been a source of pride now looked cold and hollow to him. Everywhere his gaze landed, he saw flashes of Grace's tired eyes, her shaking hands, her whispered plea over the phone. By the time the sun set again, a decision had formed in him that he could not quite explain, though it pulled him toward something human and unpracticed. He knew one thing with absolute clarity: he would not stand by and let that child die while he had the power to intervene. However, he also understood that he could not simply stride up to Grace, reveal his wealth, and offer a check. Her dignity had been visible even in the way she smoothed sheets and aligned soap bottles as if she were caring for something sacred. If he handed her money outright, she would likely refuse it, feel small, feel as though she had been turned into a charity case instead of a professional who had earned her place. Ethan Reynolds, the calculating businessman, realized that the next gamble he was about to take involved something more fragile than any investment: a stranger's trust. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, stared at his reflection in the window overlooking Central Park, and muttered to himself, "You wanted to find the dishonest ones, Ethan. Looks like you found the only honest soul left in this place." He still had no idea exactly how he would help her, but he knew with certainty that he was not going to watch a 7-year-old boy slip away while he stood behind a wall of glass and gold. For the first time in years, his heart raced, not from the thrill of a deal, but from a sense of purpose he had nearly forgotten. If you imagine yourself in Ethan's position that night, hidden in the corridor, watching Grace break down over that phone call, do you believe you would have stepped into the room and revealed who you really were? Or would you have stayed in the shadows, telling yourself it was none of your business even though you knew it was? The next morning, the city woke under a veil of cold mist that blurred the skyline, and Ethan arrived at the Reynolds Grand earlier than usual, moving with the certainty of someone who had already chosen his path. He had spent most of the night sketching out an idea on hotel stationery, something that looked on paper like a routine corporate initiative, but in truth was aimed at one specific housekeeper and her unseen child. The plan was simple in structure, but complicated in motive: a staff-wide employee excellence program, a contest in which the worker who received the most positive guest reviews over the next month would win a $50,000 reward. For Grace, that amount would cover nearly all of Noah's medical expenses. For the hotel, it would appear to be a generous but legitimate incentive program. To Grace, if she won, it would feel earned rather than gifted. He summoned Daniel Cooper to his office and slid the drafted announcement across the desk. "We're launching this program immediately," Ethan said, his tone crisp. "I want it announced to all staff today. The employee who receives the most positive feedback from guests over the next month gets the reward. No exceptions, no quiet favoritism, everything documented." Daniel stared at the number on the page and swallowed. "That is a massive bonus for one employee, sir," he said carefully, "especially if it ends up going to someone from housekeeping." "For whoever earns it," Ethan replied, his voice sharpening. "And I want you to make sure Grace Miller is regularly assigned to rooms occupied by our highest-profile guests, the ones most likely to fill out those review cards." Daniel hesitated, clearly aware that there was something personal moving beneath what sounded like a neutral policy, but he knew better than to question his employer's motives. Within hours, the competition was officially announced, and the staff buzzed with excitement and speculation. Whispers drifted down the hallways. Some employees saw the bonus as life-changing, others as a distant dream. When Grace heard the news, she allowed herself a small, uncertain smile. A look that suggested hope was trying to flicker back to life inside her, but did not yet dare to burn too brightly. She knew she needed the money desperately, yet she told herself not to expect miracles, because in her experience, people like her did not win prizes in places like the Reynolds Grand. Over the next week, Ethan watched her from a careful distance, keeping his cover intact while he tracked every detail. She arrived early and left late, working with a quiet reverence that made even the wealthiest guests notice. She checked every corner of each room, adjusted curtains, fluffed pillows, and spoke to guests with a gentleness that never crossed into subservience. Each morning, Ethan filled out comment cards under different fake names, praising her service with phrases like impeccable attention to detail and kindest staff member I have ever met, leaving a trail of glowing reviews that nudged her closer to the top. At night, doubts crept in. One afternoon, while waiting for the elevator, he heard her voice again, floating down the hallway from a partially open door. Grace stood with her back to him, phone pressed to her ear, shoulders hunched inward. "Please just tell me he is breathing better today," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, I will be there after my shift. No, I can't afford another day off. Please don't mention it to the doctor. I really need to keep this job." Ethan turned away, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. His plan, which had seemed clever and noble the night before, suddenly felt cruel because every hour that passed was an hour Noah did not have. Waiting a full month to crown a contest winner might be a luxury the boy could not afford. That night, Ethan called a close friend, one of the best pediatric surgeons in the country, and described Noah's condition without revealing names. The doctor listened in silence, then sighed. "If this child doesn't receive surgery within the next 3 weeks," he said, "his chances of survival are extremely low." 3 weeks. The words slammed into Ethan like a physical blow. He had been obsessed with making the help appear fair and earned, so much so that he had ignored the ticking clock on the other side of those hospital doors. The following morning, he ripped the contest paperwork in half and threw it away. Enough of carefully staged generosity and pride disguised as strategy. He still could not simply stride into Grace's life waving a blank check, but he understood that his obsession with appearances was starting to look like cowardice. By noon, he had made another decision. He called Daniel into his office again, his expression leaving no room for argument. "Send Grace Miller to my office," he said. "Now?" Daniel asked, eyebrows rising. "Now," Ethan repeated in a tone that ended the discussion. Grace arrived 20 minutes later, uniform perfectly pressed, hair neatly tied back, her expression composed but tight. She stepped into the office like someone walking into a courtroom, bracing for a verdict. "Mr. Cooper said you wanted to see me, sir," she said, her voice polite but edged with fear. Ethan gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Please, have a seat," he said. She sat on the edge of the chair, hands knotted together in her lap, every muscle tense as she waited for whatever bad news she believed must be coming. Ethan took a breath that felt heavier than most boardroom announcements he had made. "Grace," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I need to tell you something important. My name is not Ethan Grant. My name is Ethan Reynolds, and I am the owner of this hotel." The silence that followed seemed to thicken the air between them. Grace blinked, confusion flashing across her face and then dissolving into alarm. "Oh my God," she whispered. I didn't know. I swear I haven't done anything wrong, sir. I work hard, He raised a hand gently, stopping the spiral. "You haven't done anything wrong," he said. "In fact, the opposite is true." He told her everything. How he had checked into the hotel under a false name to observe the staff, how he had deliberately left money and jewelry in his room to test her, how he had stood outside the door while she worked. Her shoulders trembled as she listened, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely more than a breath. "You left the money on purpose," she said. "Yes," he answered quietly. "And you watched me ignore it," she continued, tears collecting at the corners of her eyes. "I watched you put it exactly where it was, and refused to take a cent that was not yours," Ethan said. "You showed integrity when no one, including me, deserved your trust." Tears slipped free now, carving pale lines down her cheeks. "I wasn't raised to take what doesn't belong to me," she whispered. I know, he replied, feeling a tightness in his own throat that surprised him. I also know about your son. Her head snapped up. Noah, she asked, panic instantly flooding her features. I overheard part of your phone call the other day, Ethan said carefully. I know he is sick, and I know you have been trying to find the money for his surgery. Grace's face crumpled as if someone had pulled a string. She covered her mouth with one hand, shaking her head. Please don't fire me, she said, the words tumbling out. I swear I never let it affect my work. I need this job more than you can imagine. I am not firing you, Ethan said firmly. I brought you here because I want to help you. She froze, staring at him as though she did not fully understand the language he was speaking. Help? She repeated. He explained that he was creating a special fund for employees facing serious personal crises, part of a new initiative that would never be advertised to the public. The company, he told her, would pay the full cost of Noah's surgery. She would owe nothing back. When she was ready to return to work, he wanted her to come back not as a housekeeper, but as the head supervisor of housekeeping, a position and salary she had already earned through her work ethic and character. Grace's hand flew to her chest. Why would you do that for me? She asked, her voice shaking. You don't even know me. Ethan looked down for a moment, then met her gaze. Because for too long I measured success in profit margins and glass towers, he said. Watching you show up every day and fight quietly for your child reminded me what real worth looks like. You have given more of yourself than anyone here, and I have been blind to that kind of value. She began to cry in great, wrenching sobs that seemed to release years of fear and exhaustion, the kind of tears that left no room for pretenses. I don't know how to thank you, she managed. You don't need to thank me, he said gently. Just be there for your son. Let that be enough. He stood and walked around the desk, hesitating only for a second before placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, tears still wet on her face, but for the first time since he had seen her in a hallway, she did not look merely tired. She looked alive, as if hope had finally found a way back into her bones. Schedule the surgery, he said quietly. Everything has already been arranged. Dr. Andrews at St. Luke's has agreed to take Noah's case personally. Her breath caught. You already called them? He nodded. Your son's operation is scheduled for Monday morning. Grace stood so quickly the chair scraped across the floor. She seemed to search for words, and then gave up, stepping forward to wrap her arms around him in a desperate, grateful embrace. It took him by surprise, but after a heartbeat he returned it, feeling something in his own chest crack open and start to shift. That night, Ethan did not return to his vast penthouse. Instead, he remained in the hotel suite where his undercover experiment had begun, staring out at the scattered city lights. For the first time since he had taken over his family's business, he found his mind occupied not by projected numbers or potential expansions, but by the image of a trembling woman and the unseen boy whose life was now tethered to a decision he had made. He had always believed compassion made people soft, and softness, in his world, had been synonymous with weakness. Now he was no longer sure. The morning of the surgery arrived under a sky the color of muted steel. Ethan sat in the waiting room of St. Luke's Medical Center beside Grace, whose fingers were laced so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white. He stared at the double doors leading into the operating area, doors that looked painfully ordinary for a place where life and death were being decided. He was not thinking about investors or branding. He was thinking about a small 7-year-old boy lying underneath bright surgical lights, fighting for air. When Dr. Andrews finally walked out, his surgical mask pulled down and a trace of exhaustion around his eyes, Grace shot to her feet. For a brief moment, no one said anything, and the whole room seemed to exhale together. Then the doctor smiled. He made it, he said. The surgery was a success. Grace collapsed into Ethan's arms, sobbing into his suit jacket, and he tightened his hold around her without the slightest concern for who might be watching or what they might think. All he felt was relief so sharp it almost hurt, accompanied by a strange, unfamiliar gratitude that life had given him the chance to change someone else's ending. In the weeks that followed, Ethan visited Noah frequently. At first, he told himself it was about checking on the outcome of his financial decision, making sure the hospital had fulfilled their responsibilities. Soon, he stopped pretending. He enjoyed being there. He liked listening to Noah's quiet laugh when Grace read to him, seeing the spark of mischief in the boy's eyes when he felt strong enough to joke. The child reminded Ethan of a feeling he had not allowed himself in years, caring about someone without expecting anything in return. Grace's gratitude was steady, but never embellished. She did not act as if he had descended from the heavens to save them. She thanked him, but she also continued to work hard and stand tall, and that made Ethan respect her even more. When Noah was finally discharged from the hospital, Ethan made sure they did not go back to a cramped, failing apartment. While they had been at the hospital, he had quietly arranged for their home to be renovated. Fresh paint on the walls, safe new furniture, a kitchen stocked with food that did not come from the discount aisle. Grace cried again when she saw it, overwhelmed by the abundance, and he told her simply that she deserved to live somewhere that did not constantly remind her of struggle. 3 months later, Grace returned to the Reynolds Grand Hotel, not with a cleaning cart, but as the new housekeeping supervisor. Her salary had tripled, and with each passing day her confidence grew more visible. Guests commented not just on the immaculate state of their rooms, but on her patience, her kindness, and the pride she took in every task, whether it was turning down a bed or training a new employee. Ethan noticed that when she walked through the halls now, staff members straightened up a little, as if her story had quietly become part of the hotel's soul. She was no longer invisible. Something fundamental had shifted inside Ethan as well. The thrill he once felt when closing a massive deal or acquiring another property now seemed hollow compared to the quiet contentment of watching Noah chase pigeons in Central Park or seeing Grace laugh freely at his dining table. He found himself looking forward to dinners with them, to the sound of conversation filling a home that had long echoed with silence. A year passed, and one evening he invited them both to his personal residence for dinner. He cooked paella using his mother's old recipe, the smell filling the space with a warmth he had almost forgotten. They ate together while the city lights glowed beyond the windows. Later, after Noah fell asleep on the couch with a blanket tucked around him, Grace turned to Ethan. "You've changed," she said quietly, studying his face. "When I first saw you, before I knew who you really were, you looked powerful, but you also looked incredibly lonely." He let out a faint, rueful smile. "Maybe I was," he admitted. "Why did you really do all of this?" she asked. "Not just the surgery or the job, all of it." He paused, searching for words that meant more than platitudes. "Because you reminded me what kind of man I wanted to be before I became the man I thought I had to be," he said at last. She did not answer with words. She simply held his gaze, and in her eyes he saw understanding and something like forgiveness. Over the next few years, the change inside Ethan deepened and spread. He expanded the discreet emergency fund, privately naming it in his own mind, the Noah Initiative. It paid for medical crises, educational opportunities, and family support for employees across all his properties, without unnecessary red tape or public announcements. He never turned it into a marketing campaign or a headline. He did not need applause. Within 5 years, the fund had quietly helped more than 50 employees and their families. Grace continued to rise through the ranks until she became director of hotel operations, the highest position beneath Ethan himself. Staff admired her not just because she had authority, but because she had lived the hardest jobs and never forgot how that felt. Noah grew into a bright, energetic teenager with healthy lungs and a stubborn streak. On some weekends, he worked part-time at the hotel, greeting guests with a charm that reminded Ethan painfully and beautifully of Grace. When people asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, he always said he wanted to become a doctor so that he could help children who were fighting the same kind of battles he once had. The day Grace married, Ethan walked her down the aisle. She had fallen in love with a kind-hearted doctor she met during Noah's follow-up appointments, a man who respected her strength and treated Noah as his own son. As she reached the altar, she looked back at Ethan with tears shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He shook his head, emotion thick in his voice. "No, Grace," he said. "Thank you for reminding me that success without compassion is just an empty room in a very tall building." Years later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Ethan sat at his breakfast table scrolling through his phone. His background image was no longer a company logo or a chart of rising numbers. It was a photo of him sitting on the grass in Central Park beside Grace and Noah, all three of them laughing, sunlight catching in their hair. He realized he was smiling without even thinking about it. Every so often, he still walked the halls of the Reynolds Grand Hotel, this time as an owner who understood that his staff were the true heartbeat of the place. When he saw a young housekeeper cleaning a room with the same careful pride Grace once had, he sometimes slipped a small envelope under their cart, a quiet bonus, a handwritten note of encouragement. He never signed his name, never asked for thanks. It was enough to remember the night everything had changed. One trembling phone call, one honest woman who refused to steal even when her world was falling apart, one child who would not stop fighting for life. Over time, the man who had once been whispered about as the coldest figure in New York's luxury hotel world came to be known for something entirely different. The Reynolds Grand was still luxurious, but now it was also known for being humane. Employees understood that if life ever knocked them down, they were not alone. Someone would be there to help them stand again. The hotel stopped being just a business in Ethan's eyes. It became something closer to a family. Sometimes at night, when the city's noise softened and the lights outside his window blurred, Ethan would hear Grace's voice in his memory saying, "You've changed," and he would catch himself smiling and reply into the quiet, "You were right." Now imagine you are watching this story unfold in front of you and ask yourself honestly whether you believe that a single act of kindness, offered at the right moment, can truly transform a person's heart and the direction of their life. If you feel that Ethan discovered something far greater than wealth, write 100 in the comments and tell us which country you are watching from. And if this story moved you or reminded you that compassion still matters in this world, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss more stories that celebrate the power of kindness, second chances, and quiet heroes like Grace and Noah.